just a couple of reactions on the comments that have been made. First of all, I think it is a bit in the nature of reporting or corporate reporting of being to some extent backward looking in nature. That doesn't mean that issuers shouldn't make efforts to provide more forward-looking information, but I think it is to some extent in the nature of reporting, at least at the level of the non-financial statement as it is required today, to focus on what has happened rather than what is likely to happen in the future. I think that is also where we focus our attention in the statement for the enforcement priorities, to say that the quality of the disclosures is important, the requirements are there in the directive, and issuers can make an effort to provide information that are useful to users. So if users ask for more information regarding the future developments of a certain non-financial matter, for example climate change, then companies may need to be responsive to those requests, and the requirements are there in the directive. They're quite broad, and they can be interpreted in a way that provides a full set of disclosures. On the machine readability, of course, at this stage we aren't there yet. I think the first step, perhaps most needed, is as we indicated in the consultation to the fitness check, was to have a more structured set of requirements in the first place, and then think about digitalization. But I think is a fair point that machine readability would improve the usability of the information. On just one comment on the increasing requirements that issuers are facing at the moment. I think the most important point that was made, amongst others, was about the dialogue that is needed, and we also wanted to have a session on corporate reporting today, to some extent to foster a discussion with users and also issuers that may be represented today, to listen to both views. What are the users' needs again, and what are the issues that companies face today, and try to see where a step forward can be made.
Just maybe a quick reaction or clarification on the forward-looking dimension. So I think when you mentioned that reporting is by nature backward-looking, I think one dimension of what I was mentioning refers to the discussion, management discussion of risk factors, and I think by nature they are forward-looking. And if you look at the risk section of annual reports, actually the kind of implicit time horizon of this discussion is usually very short-term. So I think this is directly in the remit of the ESMA to form a view on that. The other aspect regarding quantitative data this time, what I was mentioning is not necessarily like having a crystal ball and trying to imagine what will look the future data point will look like, but there's some information that are like from the past, but still inform the future. So for instance, if you want to perform a scenario analysis from a climate perspective, you need to have like an idea of the stock of assets of a company, and like the lifetime of power plants, for instance, if you take electric utilities. And so you refer to the TCFD on your slideshow. They recommend to do scenario analysis, which is by nature forward-looking. So my understanding is there is a kind of mismatch between the intention of the guidelines that the Commission is endorsing right now and like the type of data points that are produced by corporate reporting. Yeah, and I see a gap in this field.
Can you please pass the microphone over Michel Petit, the SHIFT project. 2 points. The first one is about corporate reporting and the disparities we have between Europe and the rest of the world. In the last report by the TCFD, it was quite clear that Europe is much ahead of the other continents regarding reporting and climate reporting. And, that's the point mentioned that I think in Europe, companies in Germany and England and France are quite strong in this reporting, where in other areas it's much weaker. So we have I think there is something which is not a level playing field regarding reporting, and it's a danger, especially if you think that it won't be voluntary for a long time. I suppose it will be obligatory in very few years from now in Europe. So what are we going to do with that? First point. Second point is to go back to what Stanislas about scenarios. The most striking things in methodologies for climate change is looking at scenarios. It was a strong recommendation by the TCFD, and everybody is discussing about that, and we are working on that field for the last 6 months about scenarios and the use of scenarios by large corporate firms. It's really a challenge. It's very, very complex, and I would say to the ESMA to work with the AOPA and EBA on this field, and to have a large team working on scenarios, especially sectoral scenarios, and try to understand what happened in different sectors. Of course, oil and gas is much ahead compared to other sectors, but I think the automotive industry right now is looking at scenarios, which is what's happening in Europe. And there's other sectors will come to the use of scenarios for the future, and to look at forward-looking vision, long-term vision, will be the use of scenarios. So ESMA and AOPA and EBA should have the ability to look at this issue with a lot of people, well-paid people.
Perhaps one comment on, indeed, risk disclosures are very relevant, and at different stages we have highlighted the importance of risk disclosures and the fact that entities or companies should provide entity-specific information, thus not simply repeating every year to some extent the same messages, but doing an actual assessment of the risks with an eye to the outlook of their specific situations and their environment. So I do definitely agree that risk disclosures are prospective in nature. Indeed, scenario analysis, it is envisaged by the TCFD, which is one of the frameworks that can be used. We have made reference to the TCFD in our statement on the enforcement priorities to say that when assessing financial consequences of climate change or environmental issues, the TCFD recommendations may provide a useful basis that includes also scenario analysis. On the point of the disparities between different jurisdictions, I think that is at the very heart of our work in the area of supervisory convergence, because when we try to promote the consistent application of requirements across the EU, we precisely want to avoid a situation where we have jurisdictions in which the requirements are applied differently than others, also for legacy issues that, for example, it was mentioned earlier that one jurisdiction or one or more jurisdictions may have a longer standing experience on disclosures of non-financial information. That shouldn't mean that the other countries are not catching up with an equal level of quality of disclosures. I'll move to the other few questions that we have for you today. These are a bit more detailed. First of all, we would like to hear from you about the impact reporting. As I mentioned earlier, the non-financial reporting directive clearly refers to impact on both ways. The impacts of the environment, for example, on the issuers, and how the issuers impact the environment. And we would like to understand whether, in your view, the current practice of impact reporting provides information that is relevant for decision-making purposes. The second point has to do with non-financial risk, and I think that has been to some extent partially addressed already when you see the disclosures on non-financial risks. The question is to what extent and whether at all that help better assessing the risk-return profile of an issuer. So whether the non-financial risks are well depicted. And one other point is about KPIs. I go back to my earlier comment that the disclosure requirements are there in the directive. The directive clearly requires KPIs, policies, outcomes of the non-financial matter. The question is to what extent those are well implemented in practice. While we acknowledge that these are early days, but still the requirements are there, and we would like to hear from you what is your view as to whether the KPIs provide relevant information as currently presented. We have covered a few of those topics. Perhaps let's have a look at the additional questions that we have about the investment horizons, because there was some discussion already before on the short-termism. And here, I think it is interesting to try and disentangle the two perspectives, how financial and non-financial reporting today help or affect the investment horizons of companies, and how the financial and non-financial reporting practices may affect instead the investment horizons of investors in companies, which is a slightly different perspective, but I think it is useful to see whether you have any comments or views in this regard.
I would make provide evidence for Ravundi, who has been achieving non-financial analysis for 10 years or more than 10 years. So we take on board the ISR criteria when we invest in firms, and we provide a rate to each firm in which we invest. And we have a large part of our funds which follow this investment process, and we use to exclude companies which have not the sufficient level, the good note, sufficient good note, when we consider that this is a ESMA investment. Up to 2014, this non-financial approach to investing did not make real difference. From 2013, we have felt that things were changing, and that mostly the most institutional investors or sovereign funds do take into consideration the fact that we practice non-financial analysis, and we have better returns on all investments for which we achieve this non-financial analysis. The second point is that we have a true difficulty when assessing the information about climate, mostly about environment, because of the non-standardized criteria which are used all over Europe. there are several labels in several countries, but those national labels do not coincide or are not harmonized, and sometimes they may be even contradictory on the same topic. So there is a need of standardization, and probably it will be possible through taxonomy, first of all on environment.
On this question, I think it's not so much that the corporate reporting requirements oblige companies to focus on the short term. It's like there's a lot of pressure to focus on the short term related to equity research. I mean, the focus of financial analysts in general, which have been discussed previously, and there's no kind of obligation on corporate reporting that will kind of counterbalance that. So all the obligations that are actually enforced by supervisors relate to either the past or the very short term, and there is no obligation on the long term. So I used to advise company on like how to manage long-term risk, and so basically even if they are if a risk is material and they are willing to report on that, there is zero incentive to do that. So every legal department of a large company will kind of censor any type of forward-looking disclosure on a long-term horizon because there's nothing in it for them. Like most investors don't request this type of information, or at least when they do it in the analyst call after that, everything is focused on the next quarter, and there is no regulation. So I mean, a company who would have some willingness to report on long-term risk and discuss them seriously will end up perceiving that as a risk to lose competitive, like to create I would say a kind of liability from a competitive perspective, because an investor will analyze that as an acknowledgement of a weakness rather than transparency on the long-term risk, because peers don't do that. And so I think the framework doesn't give the room to issuers to discuss long-term risk in their public statements. So we published a report on this, both documenting the state of long-term disclosure, financial disclosure in MSCI World companies. It's on our website, and this problem of this kind of equation that prevents issuers to report on long-term risk. And I think most of the issues that can, like the kind of, most of the acupuncture points in regulation are actually in the remit of the ESMA.
There is also one question in the back. We can't hear.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a general comment on distinction between financial and non-financial. On the one hand, I have the impression that in the debate from a conceptual point of view, it's getting more and more blur, and sometimes it just doesn't make sense because, for instance, you can have financial risk that have a direct impact on credit risk, and it's not non-financial risk, it's financial risk. And I've been impression that sometimes it's a bit unfair. And I also wanted to stress on the slide before that the first one was on financial disclosures about investments, that companies do not only need non-financial disclosure, but also need financial disclosure. Sometimes need more granularity about some financial disclosures, like CapEx and so on, to make an assessment. And that's restraining the focus to non-financial disclosure.
Thanks very much. I think on this last point, we have one of the areas that we have looked at, obviously, on this 2017 reports is also the degree to which financial and non-financial information are integrated, because again, the directive gives the possibility, or actually indicates to issuers that they should disclose also additional references or explanation in the non-financial statements about the financial statements. So this integration is something that is quite important. That's why we didn't also wanted to look separately at financial and non-financial reporting. I think the broad perspective that the European Commission's action plan gives is to consider corporate reporting in its entirety and how that fits with the shift towards a more sustainable financial system. With that, I think if there are no other comments.
Yeah, I think from my side, what is interesting and what I also take from this debate, clearly I personally have the view that what is in the corporate reporting area, it's not sufficiently standardized or harmonized. So it's a reference which is done to no matter which framework a company is willing to use. So that doesn't help in terms of comparability. So that doesn't help the analyst in terms of looking to the data and say, okay, between these two companies, I really can make a judgment. So it's still very much judgmental. It doesn't help. Hopefully, with the guidelines don't help yet either. Let's see what the Commission will plan to do in terms of next steps. What it's difficult for us, and it's true that we as securities regulators, we look to not only to the financial statement but to the MD&A part, which should probably give a bit more insight about the forward-looking information. But what is interesting, what I heard, that actually the analysts themselves are putting the pressure on, having the information rather on short-term part and are not necessarily very are not necessarily putting the pressure yet on the long-term side. And I think there we make a bit the link on this whole package where you go from the beginning until the end, and probably the investors are saying, well, we are interested to see what is the impact on long term, then we will close the circle and we'll end up with a good solution. Any final round of comments or questions? Can you have the microphone here, please?
Just two questions. The first is about the long-term risks. I would comment that, saying that in the oil and gas industry, we are seeing much shorter time horizon in the investments that have been done for the last few years. A lot of pressure to invest more in oil shale and so on, instead of huge, gigantic projects. So the hundreds of billions of dollars which are invested in the industry, I think their time horizon is shortening, and it has to do something with the fact that this sector is in the plain light of the climate change risk. First point. The second point is linked to this one, is about the stranded asset issue, which is at the heart of the risk management regarding climate change. What I've seen in the last few years is that it's no longer, well, some people would say, like in the TCFD, that it's a rational discussion about what kind of risk we have as stranded assets. Other people would say it's just ethical risks, like tobacco and so on. There's exclusions from investment by certain kind of investors. What I can see now is more reputational risk. People are doing what others are doing because they don't want to be pointed at fingers. So it's very bizarre because if you look from the financial point of view, for instance, for life insurance or pension funds, to have stranded assets by itself, it's not really an issue. The issue is to have stranded revenues. And of course, with reputational risk, maybe sometime there will be no value for assets, but there will be still some revenues from the assets. So I would like the ESMA to look with your thought about this issue. What is really stranded assets? What do you really mean by that? Because the literature on this field is very, very weak.
Thank you. On the first question about the European Commission's the revision of the guidelines and the report from the TEG,